The sound of engines grows silent on a dusty road outside Ouagadougou. Long lines of trucks wait, their tanks empty, their drivers frustrated. In the markets, families whisper about prices that climb with each passing week. And in the West, from Wall Street to Washington, powerful men and women are asking the same question. What just happened in Burkina Faso? For the first time in modern history, a small landlocked African nation has said no to the rules of the global oil market. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, stood before his people and declared that oil would no longer be sold cheaply to foreign companies. Instead, it would fuel Africa's rise. His exact words were clear. Our oil will not light foreign cities while our children sit in darkness. Imagine that. In a world where oil prices dictate wars, elections, and economies, a nation that many Americans could not locate on a map has become the center of a storm. For the people of Burkina Faso, this is about dignity and survival. For the West, it is about control. Consider a grandmother named Mariam, who cooks meals over firewood because she cannot afford kerosene. For her, Traoré's decision is not about politics, but about whether her grandchildren will breathe smoke-filled air or study by clean light. And consider a retired oil worker in Houston, watching the news with disbelief, asking himself if Africa is about to shake the very market that sustained his career. This is the story we will uncover today. The oil war Africa has just started and why the West is panicking. But the question remains, is this the beginning of a new dawn or the opening shot of a dangerous conflict? Stay with us, because the answer will shape not only Africa's destiny, but the balance of power across the globe. The breaking point came in early September, when Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before Parliament in Ouagadougou and announced a radical shift in Burkina Faso's oil policy. For decades, like much of Africa, the nation's small reserves of crude oil had been managed under contracts written in Paris, London, and Washington. Oil was extracted, shipped abroad, refined overseas, and then sold back to Burkinabe citizens at inflated prices. The cycle kept the country dependent, while others grew rich. But Traoré's new declaration ended that model with a single statement. Our oil will build our schools, power our homes, and create jobs for our youth. It will no longer leave as raw wealth for others to refine. This announcement marked the beginning of what observers are calling Africa's new oil war. For Burkina Faso, the plan is simple but bold. Instead of exporting crude, the government signed new agreements with India and China to finance and build local refineries. These facilities will employ Burkinabe engineers and technicians, with training provided by members of the diaspora returning from Europe and the United States. The deals also guarantee that at least 60% of profits will stay within Burkina Faso to fund infrastructure, education, and health care. The reaction on the ground was immediate. In a small village outside Bobo Dioulasso, families gathered to witness the groundbreaking of a pilot refinery project. For them, this was not an abstract policy, but a promise of cheaper fuel and more reliable electricity. One farmer, Isa, explained that he used to spend half his income on imported diesel just to run his irrigation pump. Last year he nearly lost his harvest. With the new project, he hopes to irrigate his fields at a fraction of the cost. For the first time, he said, I believe the land will feed my children. International markets also felt the tremor. Brent crude prices jumped 6% in the days following the announcement. Traders in London and New York dismissed Burkina Faso's oil reserves as modest, but the symbolism worried them. If one small country could break away from the global system, what would stop larger producers like Nigeria or Angola from following suit? Analysts warned that such a domino effect could reshape the energy market in ways unseen since the oil shocks of the 1970s. Inside Burkina Faso, however, not everyone celebrated. Opposition politicians accused Traoré of recklessness. They warned that Western governments would not tolerate such defiance and might respond with sanctions or financial restrictions. French newspapers described the move as romantic politics, a gesture destined to collapse under the weight of global realities. American think tanks labeled it resource nationalism, a dangerous experiment likely to harm the very people it claimed to protect. But among the youth of Burkina Faso, the decision sparked pride and unity. University students marched with banners reading "Oil for the People" and "Fuel for Freedom." Radio programs debated the meaning of sovereignty. For many young listeners, the announcement was the first time they felt their nation had taken control of its destiny. A student named Fatima told reporters, "We grew up hearing that Africa is rich, but Africans are poor. Now maybe that will change." The diaspora also began to stir. In Atlanta, Chicago, and New York, African American leaders compared Traoré's words to the language of the civil rights movement. Churches hosted forums titled "Africa's Oil, Our Responsibility." For older Americans who had marched in the 1960s, the echoes were unmistakable. One retired pastor explained, "Just as we once demanded dignity in America, Africa is now demanding dignity with its own resources. The struggle is the same." Yet beneath the celebrations lay uncertainty. Could Burkina Faso withstand pressure from powerful nations and corporations? Would local refineries be completed on time? Would food and fuel prices stabilize before the poorest citizens lost patience? These questions lingered in homes and marketplaces. A grandmother named Mariam, who still cooks with firewood, expressed both hope and fear. "If this change brings us light, it will be a blessing. But if the world punishes us, my grandchildren may suffer before they see the light." The main event, then, is not only about contracts or refineries. It is about identity. It is about a nation deciding that its oil belongs to its people, not to outsiders. By doing so, Burkina Faso has set a precedent that could inspire other African nations to follow. Whether this sparks a wave of liberation or a storm of retaliation remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the decision has already changed the conversation. Africa is no longer just a supplier of raw materials. It is beginning to write its own rules. And for the West, that is reason enough to panic. The true climax of this story came not in a closed-door meeting or a quiet negotiation, but in a thunderous speech delivered in front of Burkina Faso's parliament. With the national flag behind him and television cameras broadcasting across the continent, Captain Ibrahim Traoré raised his hand and declared, "They told us we are too small to manage our own oil. They said our wealth belongs to the markets of Paris and New York. But I tell you today, this oil belongs to the people of Burkina Faso, and it will serve their children, not foreign masters." His words ignited an explosion of emotion. The streets of Ouagadougou erupted. Tens of thousands poured out of homes and workplaces to celebrate. Young men climbed onto rooftops, waving flags and chanting slogans. Women marched together, banging pots and pans in unison, a sound that echoed through the night as a call for freedom. Market vendors closed their stalls, not out of fear, but to join in the celebration. For many, it was the first time they felt the weight of history shifting in their favor. One man, Karim, a taxi driver who had spent years struggling to pay for imported fuel, summed up the mood. "For the first time, I believe my children will live with dignity. If this is war, then it is a war worth fighting." His voice, weary yet proud, captured the determination of a people long denied the benefits of their own resources. But while the crowds cheered, the world outside Burkina Faso reacted with alarm. In Paris, government officials described Traoré as reckless and dangerous. French media painted him as a firebrand, leading his nation toward economic ruin. In Washington, analysts gathered in think tanks to assess the implications. A policy brief warned that Chinese and Russian partnerships with Burkina Faso could reshape Africa's energy market and undermine U.S. strategic interests. On cable news, commentators debated whether America should see Traoré as a partner or an adversary. Reactions across Africa were mixed. In neighboring Mali and Niger, leaders sympathetic to Traoré's defiance expressed quiet support. Citizens there followed the events closely, with many saying, "If Burkina Faso can do this, why not us?" Yet in other African capitals, leaders hesitated, worried about losing Western aid and investment. The African Union found itself divided, caught between a wave of popular enthusiasm and the fear of economic retaliation. Meanwhile, in the United States, the African American community responded with a surge of interest. Churches in Atlanta and Chicago held prayer vigils for Burkina Faso, framing Traoré's struggle as part of a broader fight for justice. Civil rights veterans compared his words to those of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. On talk radio, callers asked whether Black America had a responsibility to support Africa in this new chapter. Some saw an opportunity for investment and cultural exchange. Others feared that too close an embrace might draw them into geopolitical conflict. But not everyone was inspired. Opposition leaders inside Burkina Faso warned that sanctions or blockades could devastate the economy. They argued that Traoré had placed the nation in the crosshairs of powerful enemies. Some even accused him of gambling with the survival of the country. International corporations began to lobby for stronger measures, suggesting that investment in Burkina Faso was now too risky. Rumors circulated of possible financial restrictions, travel bans, and trade interruptions. The contrast between joy in the streets and fear in the boardrooms was striking. In the capital, people celebrated with music and dance. Families spoke of a future where their children might have jobs in local refineries, rather than seeking survival abroad. Yet in Washington and Paris, officials whispered about strategies to bring Burkina Faso back into line. It was a clash not just of policies, but of visions, one of sovereignty and dignity, the other of control and order. This was the high point of emotion and conflict. A small, landlocked nation had dared to defy a global system built over decades, and the world was forced to respond. Hope surged among the people, but so did fear of what might come next. Would Burkina Faso's defiance inspire a continental movement, or would it be crushed before it had a chance to grow? The answer remained uncertain. But one thing was undeniable. The oil war was no longer a whisper in Parliament or a line in a contract. It was alive in the hearts of millions, and it had captured the attention of the world. The immediate civil consequences of Traoré's oil gamble could be felt in the markets of Burkina Faso. Food vendors in Ouagadougou noticed that within days of the announcement, the price of imported rice and flour rose sharply. Traders explained that nervous suppliers were adjusting costs, worried about possible sanctions or disruptions in transport. For families already living on the edge, this was a heavy burden. A mother named Salimata confessed, "I support our president, but I am afraid. If prices rise too much, how will I feed my children?" Her fear was echoed across countless households. Yet not all changes were negative. In villages where pilot refinery projects began, fuel became more affordable. Farmers in Kudugu reported that diesel for irrigation pumps dropped nearly 30% compared to the previous season. This small relief transformed their outlook. Instead of planting only half their fields, they prepared to cultivate every acre. A farmer named Musa told local radio, "If this continues, we will not only feed ourselves, but also sell to the cities." The contrast between urban anxiety and rural optimism revealed the uneven but powerful effects of the new policy. Politically, the consequences were even sharper. Inside Parliament, debates turned fiery. Supporters of Traoré hailed the initiative as a historic step toward independence, comparing it to the liberation struggles of the 20th century. They argued that Burkina Faso finally had a leader who refused to bow to foreign interests. Opponents, however, accused the government of dragging the nation into dangerous waters without a safety net. Some called for immediate negotiations with Western powers to avoid sanctions. A few even demanded early elections, claiming that such a dramatic shift required a renewed mandate from the people. Beyond the walls of Parliament, the streets became a stage for political theater. Youth groups marched in support of Traoré, carrying banners with slogans like "Our oil, our future," and "Sovereignty or nothing." Their rallies attracted thousands, creating a sense of unity and pride not seen in years. At the same time, smaller groups of opposition supporters staged protests demanding moderation. Clashes occasionally broke out, forcing police to intervene. Though violence remained limited, the tension was undeniable. Religious leaders played a calming role. In Friday sermons and Sunday services, imams and pastors reminded their congregations that every great struggle demands sacrifice. They urged patience and unity, connecting the oil initiative to biblical and Quranic stories of liberation. One pastor preached, "Just as Moses led his people through the desert before reaching the promised land, so too must Burkina Faso endure hardship before reaching freedom." These words comforted some, but others remained fearful that faith alone could not put food on the table. The political consequences also reached beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Leaders in Mali and Niger, already aligned with Traoré in the Sahel Alliance, expressed solidarity. They too had criticized Western dominance and saw in Burkina Faso's defiance a chance to strengthen their own claims to sovereignty. Rumors circulated of discussions about creating a regional oil bloc, one that could pool resources and resist outside pressure. If realized, such a bloc could shift the balance of power in West Africa dramatically. But not every neighbor was supportive. Some governments, dependent on Western aid, distanced themselves from Traoré's experiment. They warned privately that Burkina Faso risked isolation and economic collapse. Inside the African Union, debates grew heated. Should the continent rally around Burkina Faso's boldness, or should it prioritize stability and avoid antagonizing the West? The Union's silence reflected its division. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were personal and emotional. Families debated whether to stay in Burkina Faso or seek work abroad. Some young men who had once dreamed of migrating to Europe reconsidered, believing there might now be opportunities at home. A university student explained, "If we can control our oil, maybe we can build jobs here. maybe I will not need to leave. For many, hope and fear now coexisted, pulling the nation in two directions. The political consequences were equally stark. Traoré's popularity soared among loyal supporters, but opposition figures hardened their resistance. The risk of deeper polarization loomed large. If the economic situation worsened, the fragile unity in the streets could fracture into unrest. This is the battlefield of today's Burkina Faso. It is not fought with tanks or guns, but with fuel prices, political speeches, and the hearts of ordinary families. The nation stands on the knife's edge between pride and hardship, sovereignty and instability. But one question remains unanswered. How will the United States and its allies react to this defiance? And what will their response mean for the fragile security of the entire Sahel region? In Washington, the developments in Burkina Faso triggered urgent meetings across government agencies. At the State Department, officials spoke cautiously of monitoring the situation and encouraging regional stability. Yet behind closed doors, the tone was more serious. Intelligence reports warned that if Burkina Faso's model spread, larger oil producers might follow, threatening U.S. access to critical energy supplies. Analysts compared the risk to the oil crises of the 1970s, when American families waited in long lines at gas stations. For older Americans, those memories remain vivid, and policymakers feared a repeat on a global scale. At the Pentagon, strategists raised concerns that Chinese and Russian partnerships with Burkina Faso could expand influence in the Sahel. A classified briefing noted, "This is not only about oil. It is about who sets the rules of global power." Such statements reflected the unease of a superpower suddenly confronted with a small African nation rewriting the script. Europe's reaction was sharper. France openly condemned Traoré's decision, calling it reckless and destabilizing. European Union officials discussed economic measures, though divisions emerged. Some argued that sanctions could push Burkina Faso closer to rival powers. Others warned that inaction would encourage more African countries to break away from the established system. Meanwhile, Russia and China responded with interest. Russian state media framed Traoré as a hero standing up to Western domination. Chinese officials hinted at future investments, positioning themselves as partners willing to support Africa's sovereignty. Their messages were carefully crafted to appeal not only to African leaders, but also to global audiences disillusioned with Western dominance. Inside the United States, reactions were not confined to government. African American communities held forums and church services, connecting Burkina Faso's defiance to the long struggle for dignity and justice. Some saw an opportunity for economic and cultural partnerships. Others worried that such involvement might spark backlash from Washington. Still, the conversation had begun, and it carried echoes of the civil rights era. The global stage is now divided. Will the West treat Burkina Faso as a threat to be contained, or as a partner in a new chapter of energy independence? And if confrontation comes, will it remain economic, or escalate into something far more dangerous? The answers will shape not only Burkina Faso's future, but also the security of the entire Sahel, and perhaps even the stability of the world's energy markets. Burkina Faso's oil gamble has opened a door that cannot easily be closed. For some, it is a reckless move that risks provoking powerful enemies. For others, it is an act of long-awaited justice, a declaration that Africa will no longer surrender its wealth for the benefit of others. Whatever one believes, the world now watches as a small, landlocked nation challenges an order that has existed for generations. The warnings are real. If sanctions arrive, the cost of food and fuel could rise further, punishing ordinary families. If global markets retaliate, Burkina Faso's fragile economy could stumble. Political divisions at home may deepen, and the Sahel region could face new instability. Yet the hope is equally powerful. If the refinery projects succeed, if diaspora investment continues, and if African nations stand together, this oil initiative could become the cornerstone of a new era of sovereignty. History reminds us that great changes always come with risk. The United States once faced its own energy crises, and it was bold leadership that carried the nation through. Today, Africa stands at a similar crossroads. Will Burkina Faso's courage inspire a continental awakening, or will it trigger a backlash that tests the nation's resilience to the breaking point? For the grandmother cooking over firewood, for the farmer waiting to fuel his irrigation pump, and for the student dreaming of a future at home rather than abroad, the outcome of this oil war is not an abstract matter. It is about whether their children will live with dignity. So we end with this question: is Traoré leading his people toward liberation or into peril? The answer will depend not only on global powers, but on the determination of ordinary citizens. If this story has stirred something in you, take a moment to reflect. If you believe no nation should remain in darkness while its resources fuel the world, let that conviction guide your voice. Share your thoughts, your prayers, and your hope for justice. And as always, may God bless Africa, the land of resilience and faith. May He bless America, and may He guide all nations toward a future where justice, dignity, and peace prevail.